She's here in Kent in the Center for Mobility and Spatial Planning. And I guess I'm not sure if the respondent received paper. No. Okay, that's right. Yeah. Right. So you received the abstract. So we'll frame some questions for Barbara. Barbara, can you say a couple of words about yourself that would be of interest?
Yes. So I'm working on flood resilience and flood risk management in Flanders. My approach to complexity has been out of a pragmatist need, in a sense. I was doing policy supporting research, and to kind of understand the role of spatial planning in flood risk management, I kind of naturally got to complexity theory because flood risk management hasn't been at the core of spatial planning for a long time. So now I think there's a kind of an opportunity to embrace this idea in planning practices in relation to flood risk management. So building further on that, the introduction to my research is out of flood risk management in Flanders. You can see a picture of the 1953 flooding, which caused major damages in the Netherlands, but also in Belgium. And an important reason for this was a huge dike breach. And after this, our government said, well, we will make our protection to flooding better. We will build dikes, retention basins to keep the water out. What do we see in 2010, the most recent major flooding? That actually, despite these endeavors, damages are still increasing, are quite high. And the main reason for this is the presence of vulnerable spatial development in areas that have been flooded. So what we can see in the newspaper is that the discussion now is shifting towards, well, what should we do from a spatial planning perspective? How could this have happened? And how can we prevent it in the future? But if we look at what is being researched in relation to flood risk management and what kind of knowledge is used in Flanders, we see that there's a huge emphasis on technical knowledge, on the technical systems used to manage it. But there's not a lot known on the socio-spatial embedding of these technical solutions. This picture, I think, shows this quite nicely. These caravans are a very resilient technical solution. They're flexible, they're movable. Whenever there's a flood, you could prevent damage. However, you do need someone to move them, which obviously didn't happen. So why would we even bother in spatial planning to deal with flood risks? Well, I think the definition very clearly shows that flooding is not only about the water system, it's not only the likelihood of flooding, the likelihood that the water will digress, but also the impact in case of a flood, which has very much to do with our settlement structure and our spatial structures. If we consider that flood risks are increasing, we see that this is not only due to changes in this water system, but also very much changes in our spatial system, both at the end of runoff and increased likelihood of flooding, but also this impact of flooding. So what is flood risk management then? It is any action aimed at reducing the likelihood or the impact of floods. And as such, water managers are most certainly not the only ones performing flood risk management. So what has the role of spatial planning been in flood risk management over, let's say, the last 50 years? I start with this, which is, of course, not the start of flood risk management, but you need to start somewhere. This engineering approach that really built on this belief of manageability of the nature. We could manage flooding. So solutions were sought in the water system. The spatial system didn't need to be bothered with it. We could solve it just by adjusting, by changing this water system. Then in the 80s, 90s, there came some insights into the downsides of this system, that it was not really that ecological. The policies changed towards a risk-based approach, which also included making space for rivers to overflow to accommodate the water during flooding. And here the role of spatial planning slightly became bigger, namely providing space for these retention basins, although this is still quite limited. It's just accommodating some nature space to be used. Now, considering the development I talked about before, we're now moving on and talking about a resilience approach, where the issue would be, well, how can we involve this land system more? How can we not only work on land, water, but also on land? How could they be more equal counterparts in managing flood risks? But this is still uncertain and developing, like what it would look like. So resilience, which is the central concept in this story. The definition is the capacity of a system to deal with stresses and strains. What the system is quite obvious, I think. We're talking about the spatial system and how it deals with flooding. Now, the one word in this definition that is not explained here is what do I mean? What do people mean with dealing with? What is considered to be dealing with? And if we want to understand this really reflects back to the kind of worldview you have, the kind of understanding of how the world works, which is why I ended up in this complexity meeting. So the first two approaches that I discussed, the engineering and the risk-based approach, they both consider there to be a kind of equilibrium, a kind of ideal, stable state to which a system returns after a perturbation. What complexity theory, excuse me. What complexity theory teaches us is that there is no such thing as a return to a stable equilibrium. There's always something that changed. Even though you might think you got back to the original state, you've learned, you've somehow experienced things, so there is more a kind of evolutionary perspective of change. So then the resilience would be actually the combination of these three aspects, namely robustness, in case of smaller perturbations, being able to kind of accommodate, stay more or less stable in the sense that it is possible. In a bigger one, kind of allow dynamics, but in the case of big challenges, also allowed to be transformed. And in this sense, the complexity view, it doesn't discard the other ones. It's kind of zooming out to see, if you see on the schedule, you will see that the complexity perspective also encompasses to a certain extent the robustness and the adaptability approach, but it adds the transformability to it. So how is this idea then translated into policy? And this is the policy principles that are currently used in Flanders, which already Wim talked about. Here also we're using the multi-layered safety approach, where the idea is that the water-land system is considered as a whole, and that on every aspect of it, certain interventions could be done to lower flood risks, and these are complementary and do not exclude each other. So we still have protection through dikes, but we also have prevention of damages by, for example, not building in very highly flood-prone areas, or building adaptively. There's also an aspect of prevention through infiltration, maybe not that much flood water goes onto the water system. And then there's also preparedness, which relates to emergency management. So, contents-wise, which measures should we do? We have quite a good view on what are the options, what could be done. So, why aren't we doing this? This discussion on the content, the measures, of course, strongly relates to who should do it. Because if you're suggesting that people should have adaptable housing techniques, build on stilts, or have material that is water resistant, spatial planners only have a limited say over this. They don't have control over this. These are actually land users' choices. So then I come to the second part of the policy on multi-layered water safety, that is shared responsibility, that assumes this position like it's not only the water manager anymore, maybe planners also have a role to play in setting the conditions of where to develop, but also residents themselves to prevent damages, but also on a more societal broad scale, how we deal with reimbursing damages, with carrying the financial burden of flooding, and how we actually build the building techniques we use. So if we consider all these people that are active in managing flood risks, we could say that from the perspective of one manager, he doesn't work in a vacuum. His context is built up of what these other people are doing. And as such, they influence each other highly. And I think this captures very well how we could see this. So Paul Worstel here says that there is an interdependence and co-evolutionary development of management objectives and paradigms, of characteristics, of technologies, of social routines, of infrastructure, behavior, and habits. So they co-evolve over time, and this can be a kind of explanatory framework to understand why people are acting or why people might not be acting. So this idea of co-evolution between the different actors active in flood risk management relates on the one hand to the relative autonomy, so everyone has their own competences and powers, and basically within these competences and powers does whatever they want. They don't need to agree on it. And otherwise, the feedback loops, so the idea that whatever water managers are doing will affect residents. Certain safety levels will reflect on the feeling of safety that these residents will have. So if we put this a bit more schematically, we see that there's a lot of actors active in managing flood risks. It's not just water managers, but it's also all people that build the spatial system in a sense. And there's also a huge role for indirect systems which relate to financial markets, to building activities, to real estate development and transfers. So there's a lot of people and they all influence each other. Now to make it a bit less abstract, a short example. So risk is always calculated or conceptualized as being the probability of a flood multiplied by the consequences. But this kind of simplification implies that this would be independent variables, while in fact they're not. Consider the example of the Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. Their building of dikes kind of induced a feeling of safety, and it said, well, we invested in these dikes, now it's safe to develop the areas behind it. While in fact, the building dikes will in this fact lower the probability, but building behind the dikes will increase the consequences. So in the end, despite the investment, you might not actually have lowered risks. So these two variables are not that independent at all. They very much influence each other. So then I come to the question of my research, which is how the relations and interactions between these actors contribute to the spatial development of flood risks, and as such influence the overall flood resilience. Because flood resilience is then the outcome of this co-evolutionary process. There's not one person that will determine flood resilience. It's an emergent capacity that is the outcome or the temporary outcome of this process. So I looked at the case study in the Desert Basin. I will very briefly just summarize the results of it. So I looked to the three main groups: government, market, and land users. Through interviews and surveys, I asked them what they were doing in relation to flood risk management and if they would be willing or they are encouraged to do more. And then we see on the government side that they are really embracing the resilience concept, in the sense that they are building in adaptability, trying to improve, but it is restricted to their own activities. They don't support other actors to do the same. Land users show a very passive attitude. They don't really act on flood risks and consider it to be a governmental responsibility. And market actors say, well, since there's no market demand, since residents are not interested in these kind of systems to protect themselves, there's not really a role for us to play. So how did this kind of unbalanced governance system come into being? And this is where I think the idea of co-evolution is really useful to understand. Because throughout the interviews I noticed that there are kind of people see the explain why things are as they are, referring back to how flood risks have been managed over the last 10, 20, 50 years. I will just pick out two to give an example. The fourth one, for example, is that people often refer to flood risk maps and they will say, well, I'm just outside of the flood-prone area, so I thought I was safe. Which, of course, if you consider the assumptions of these maps never claim to be. So by institutionalizing the knowledge on flood risks in this highly kind of delineating tool, you might create the perception for people that they are safe or that they are not supposed to do anything. Also in the insurance and compensation system in Flanders, we have a system where everyone pays for the damage of a few, so you are not responsibilized by paying a lot more, so people don't even know that much they are living in flood-prone areas. So these mechanisms create a kind of a side effect that are really, from this resilience perspective, unwanted. So as we see it now, this co-evolution is unbalanced, and actually the institutional framework seems to be counterproductive for the development of this kind of overall resilience. So how can we counteract this? You could come up with a lot of ideas based on examples of other countries or other situations. In the end, we don't know if they would work, but at least we could try. And I think for planners, there might be different strategies that they can try. On the one hand, they can think about the conditions that they are creating for other actors. So what are the effects of their actions, and if they do not reach this goal of overall resilience, what could they change? But also just by directly interacting with these people, just listening to how they are perceiving the problem and how they could come to a solution which would be a bit more the communicative-based approach. So I end with this concluding slide, which kind of summarizes this idea of co-evolutionary flood risk management and flood resilience that I'm trying to explain. So the first one is to say that there's a complex actor field involved, and these actors co-evolve, they mutually influence each other, and this could be an interesting avenue to consider how we will move on with flood risk management. And it's actually these interactions that will determine the overall resilience to flooding. Thank you.
Thank you. It was very interesting. I could also relate to some of the topics that you brought up in what they are doing in the development of urban code in the built environment in Arab countries. And part of the dilemma that I got to deal with was how urban code changes and how complexity deals with the different changing reality of the society, and when do I get to the limit of what complexity can offer in order to be able to deal with the built environment. Since the social code is changing, the urban code still has limitation because of the built environment. And I was wondering, did you happen to see that in your work also in flooding? Because these are all things that you can learn for new neighborhoods, but existing built neighborhoods, do you see that?
I think that's indeed a huge debate. It's easier to come up with solutions for new development than what is already there, and considering the last 50 years, there is a lot of development already there. But I think that also from a resilience perspective, there's also a part of just accepting that it will happen, and kind of by creating already a storyline on how to deal with flood risks. I think even though, like Wim said, the multi-layered safety approach is there more in story than in reality. The moment that something happens, you already made a kind of framework on how we should deal with it. So I think then the opportunity would be to change it, because with flood risks, it's also the fact you don't know if it's gonna flood, how frequently, how long it will take. So in a sense, for existing buildings, it doesn't make that much sense to already in advance, without anything ever happening, take action. But I think the social, and this is more the social capacity kind of thing, if you could already have people think about it, kind of communicate about it, and form a kind of a society or a kind of community around it, you are better prepared when it happens to then start thinking, okay, what could we do? Should we alter now that there's damage? Can we alter? Should we consider certain buildings that are too heavily damaged? Should we consider removing them? So I think this is the kind of evolutionary idea that complexity brings with it. Yeah.
Yes, I have a question. Thank you for a really interesting presentation. I think that was an excellent example of how different complex systems, as they're overlapping, they're causing really, really complicated problems, especially when you're talking about coupled human environmental systems.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of leads me to my question or comments about your conceptualization of different types of resilience. It was a nice idea, I think, to present the kind of continuum from engineering resilience to ecological and evolutive resilience, because usually I see them like presented as a progress from one to another, and you present it as a transcalar, kind of like as a question of scale.
Mm-hmm.
But when we talk about management planning of complex systems, I think it might be a little bit different when we're talking about engineering resilience and planning that, because it kind of emphasizes the optimization and making the systems effective in a linear manner, and that's really problematic, as was in your example of Hurricane Katrina, the areas which were kind of like optimized, safe, were not that actually when it comes to the question of the storm. And the evolutionary or evolutionary ecological resilience is emphasizing the building of adaptive and transformative capacity in planning. So that's kind of like two totally different things.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it can be done like building diversity, redundancy, or whatever. So, how do you see kind of this, at the same time, bringing these two together, at the same time, kind of like, do you see them separate still, planning-wise? How do you elaborate that more?
Yes. I agree that there's a kind of a dilemma between flexibility and robustness, and how far do you go with accommodating one or the other. But I do think they are overlapping in the sense that when there's a small flood, you don't want to be thinking about how I should transform. It's just a small flood. When there's a big flood, maybe you shouldn't consider, oh, let's just hide in the dike and everything is safe. So it's really a matter of scale. And I think and this is captured in what is called this capacity idea, because capacity also embraces that that as a community you can discuss what is needed, and in a sense this is the evolutionary idea. Yesterday they were deciding on a dike, tomorrow they might decide on something else, but the capacities need to develop. So yeah, considering one or the other is really a matter of the conditions, the context, and the choices that are made. It's hard to say they're wrong or they're right, but they will certainly influence how the further development goes, and in the way it translates to the capacities in a sense, because then maybe people will see after a few times like, oh, not the best option, or because it's hard to say in these uncertain conditions, like we should go for transformation. No one really knows, but you kind of have to agree that you try at least.
Yeah, I totally agree. If I can a little bit continue, like 1 minute. I think it's only a problem when you talk to a planner, because they easily adopt the idea of engineering resilience because they want to optimize things. So you have to really do a lot of work to make them understand about the adaptive capacity, not necessarily the transformation thing. So I think it's a little bit dangerous. You have to like sell the whole spectrum of ideas.
Yeah. Yeah, and the difficulty is, of course, that there's a long tradition in engineering and not that much in the capacity. So there's yeah.
Other questions? Yes.
Specifically about the last remark about this long tradition. How do they accept now what it is already, this idea? Do they feel anything about it? Do they have some steps?
Who is they?
Government, for instance?
I think the way it is in Flanders, this idea is very much embraced by the government, especially water managers, because they are feeling the limitations of their own capacities. And they have a kind of experience that they have been trying for years, but still see that it's not really, their actions are contradicted by others. The difficulty is, of course, that residents at this point don't feel this necessity. They assume the governments to be responsible, even though this is never legally set somewhere. So the challenge is not that much with our policymakers, but they, in a sense, want to convince people to take up responsibilities, which is costly and which is
It's not so costly, just open the dike.
Sorry?
Just let the water in.
Yeah.
That's the reason.
But there's a moral behind
It's a matter of skin in the game. They have no skin in the game with the consequences. I grew up in the valley of the Scout, so luckily on a higher level, but we had unfortunate neighbors who built a new house further down the road, and well, their feet got wet. So they built the house. Then the flooding came. We were on top of our little hill, so we were fine. But the consequences for these floodings, so the damages and all that stuff, was paid for by insurance companies, but also by the local community who had to do sewage works and all that kind of stuff that we all paid for. So, as a matter of fact, we redistribute this risk or the cost of these risks. And people don't feel they have skin in the game anymore. If they would say, yeah, okay, you can build this stuff, but you know, if floodings come and you want us to pay for this thing, well, okay, you pay half of the cost. No one will build there. And it's the same with it's the same with different complexity issues. If you put skin in the game there, then you get completely different results. Going from an architect having to live in the building that they build or in the towers that they build, work there for 5 years and see if they are still alive and not having a burnout, to floodings. And that's what we were pointing out with your dikes. It's so abstract. You don't feel anymore what the risks are.
I would object. I think if that happens, the deprived people would move there because the land prices would go down. And that is, I think, a big advantage to have in our Western continent, shouldn't lose it. So it's difficult what you're saying.
It's not a solution, absolutely.
Yeah, it's a thin line between creating very socially deprived areas where people, because housing is cheaper, will move in and don't have any capacities. And this reflects back to the capacities, and it's not only about the financial capacities, but also the networking, how they are embedded in their social structure, how much they know about the place they live. So I guess it's where all these things come together, and of course the financial aspect is one of them. But, yeah.
Thank you very much.